My wife and I moved to Rock Springs, Wyoming from back east in 1976. We were able to find work here and enjoyed living in the West. Back in those days, I was completely unaware of the history of the town and the presence of the old abandoned coal mines beneath it. Oddly enough, my grandmother's family, the Pendergasts, had owned a farm and a coal mine near Galesburg, Illinois in 1914. She told us stories of the mine as a young girl and how her father, James, would take her down into the mine. The shaft of the mine was deep enough that when she looked up, she could see the stars, even though it was in the middle of the day. She told us stories about her brothers and sisters in a game they played called gully jumping in the fields of their farm. These gullies turned out to be subsidence troughs or surface damage from the Pendergast mine workings. Remembering these stories, I had no idea that things like this would become important problems for me and that I would find myself out in Wyoming trying to find information about mining and its effects on home and property, including our own property. My name is Steve Shea, and what follows is some of what I learned about these issues. On the night of September 19th, 1985, our neighborhood and home were damaged by the collapse of an old coal mine. I came home from a night shift to find barricades at both ends of our street and a backhoe digging up a neighbor's broken water line. Their next-door neighbor, awakened by the sounds of their house breaking, found a 6-inch wide crack in their foundation. They moved out of their home that afternoon. The cause of this situation was an attempt by the state DEQ to fix an old underground threat to parts of the city of Rock Springs, coal mine subsidence. From 1869 to the 1930s, numerous coal mines had been worked beneath the town. Some areas were threatened early on and had had problems with it for decades, and some parts, though undermined, will probably never experience this sort of problem. This program will explain what went on during the years of mining and how this history has affected us. We want to show what occurred in the past, how the miners here lived and worked, and how this affected where we are today in our efforts to fix the problems. The story isn't all damage and disaster. Some remarkable people took on the challenge, and through their work and the cooperation of government agencies at every level, much of the threat and the damage has been brought under control. However, unfortunately, incidents continue to occur. Southern Wyoming and Rock Springs played an important part in the development of the West. The coal deposits here made it a focal point for one of the great industrial advancements of the time, the first transcontinental railroad. The story of the construction of this system is one of mismanagement and corruption at the hands of the robber barons that was typical of many railroad projects of that age. But before the crooked developers took control, several groups of men had to find the all-important route from Missouri to California. Before the Civil War, several sets of explorers had already journeyed out to find the way. They all knew that this region of the Red Desert would be a challenge to rail construction. Originally, the route looked like it might go through South Pass, but aggressive Indian activity pushed the plans for the tracks further southward. This brought back into the picture the unfriendly natural environment of the high desert. Even this far south, stage stations and other outposts had been attacked by Indians fighting against the encroachment on their territory. On top of those big issues, locomotives required plentiful wood and decent water to operate, and not much of either were available here. Then, in 1849 and 1850, Howard Stansbury, guided by Jim Bridger, observed and reported the large coal seams mixed in the sandstone formation as they traveled the Bitter Creek drainage from west to east. Stansbury is credited with discovering coal across much of the southern part of the state and documented it in his map of the West. Water could still be an issue for the workers and the locomotives, but the fuel was here if this route were taken. Fortunately for the developers, Thanks to the generous federal land grants that were the 1862 and 1864 Pacific Railway Acts, this route was right through lands containing valuable coal, much of what the UP now owned. The Union Pacific was not the first to use coal here. The Indians were known to use it, referring to it as the rock that burns. Coal was used at the Fort Bridger blacksmith shop, and soldiers burned it at several of the forts. However, the Blair brothers, Archie and Duncan, were the first to mine coal here commercially. They got their start here in 1868 as the founders of Rock Springs in Blairtown by operating the stage station and a general store near present-day I-80 in Springs Drive. When the track surveyors came through, Archie and Duncan knew that the locomotives were coming and could use their coal for fuel. Being smart businessmen, they also anticipated that the railroad would spell trouble for the overland stage operation. They began to prospect for coal in what would become Blairtown. They wisely chose the right place to start their operation when they located an 11-foot tall section of clean coal that was part of the number 1 seam. They worked it with a crew as a wagon mine, hauling coal to Rock Springs. The workers soon built shacks on the hillsides that became Blairtown. The Blairs eventually sold their lease to P.J. Quayle. At that point in time, the Union Pacific's coal projects were faced with a great opportunity provided by President Lincoln and the land grants. The big problem for them was that, in the late 1860s, the railroad company did not have a system or a coal mining department to direct their operation. Their main efforts were going into building more tracks and swindling their investors and the government. They decided to contract the mining out for several years to the discoverers of the Rock Springs coal seams, Thomas Wardell and William H. Miller, who secured what they thought was a 15-year contract as the Wyoming Coal and Mining Company in Rock Springs and in Carbon. This worked for a while for them, but then the two of them and the miners were subject to the greed and politics of the big railroad company. However, before the roof fell in on the Wyoming Coal and Mining Company, so to speak, they got off to a really good start in Carbon, Wyoming, which is near Hanna. Prospects were started in Hallville and Black Buttes as well, but Rock Springs showed the most promise. Hallville and Black Buttes did not last long, but Carbon was worked until 1902. The start of the work for the Rock Springs No. 1 mine in 1868 began with a crew with shovels, a 50-foot measuring tape, and a pit lamp used as a marker. Miller and his crew included Geordie Young, a noted miner and prospector whose descendants, along with the Blairs, still live in Rock Springs. The men dug down several feet through the silt, rocks, and dirt of the Bitter Creek Valley deposition, located the outcrop of the No. 1 seam, and somehow picked the perfect place to start the big mine's entry. The magnificent Edward Froughton statue, clearing the hallway, commemorates this occasion and the tremendous effort it took man and beast to start the development of the coal resource here. This effort contributed greatly to the profit of the UP owners, who would soon, under the direction of the infamous robber baron Jay Gould, reward them by breaking their contract and taking over the mines, ending their 15-year deal with Wardell and Miller 13 years early. The early years of coal mining were as difficult and challenging as we in the 21st century can imagine. The early miners lived in dugouts on the banks of the Bitter Creek in shacks with no running water, heat, or decent sanitation. These men were contracted to dig the coal, normally working with a partner or a close relative. There were UP employees also working in the mines later, building rail, operating equipment, and setting timbers, but the actual coaling in those early days was mostly in the hands of these miners. They had to buy all of their supplies at the Beckwith Quinn Company store, and were paid in Union Pacific Company scrip, not cash, for their hard and dangerous work. The method they used was called room and pillar mining, which is significant in modern times due to what happens when mining nears completion. Much of their day in the mine was spent either shoveling or lying on their side on the floor and undercutting the coal as far as they could by swinging a kerfing pick with one hand. The undercutting, or kerfing, allowed the coal to break into chunks when it was blasted. They would then drill, tamp, and blast the coal or rock face. After the dust had settled some and they put out the frequent fires that resulted from the blasting, they would go back into the entry and muck out or dig out the chunks of coal. Moving the coal from the rooms to the main hallway was done with horse-drawn or mule-drawn ore cars, but frequently they had to move them by hand. Their pay on each carload would be based on the weight, and deductions would be made for any rock or bony that was contained. The job of removing the sandstone and slate was often done by young boys, picking through the sharp-edged coal and rock with no gloves for hours at a time. And just trying to survive on their meager wages, the breaker boys, as they were called, could only dream of going to school. In most mines, after many years of having the breaker boys hand-pick every piece of bony from the coal, vibrating shaker screens were installed to help remove the rock chunks and to sort the coal chunks by size. A large part of the Reliance tipple was used for that purpose. Since the miners were paid by the ton, if they failed to come up with much coal, they did not make much money, so they had to work fast and steady. Besides being hard and dangerous, the work produced coal dust that settled in their lungs and produced black lung, emphysema, and other respiratory problems. It helped a great deal that care was provided by the Wyoming State Miners Hospital built here in 1894, but little could be done to mitigate many of the long-term health issues suffered by the miners. Their disabilities dragged on for years after the work in the mines had ended, and these workers frequently died young. The Rock Springs coal field is 110 miles long and has 11 workable seams. Through its development, there were more than 35 mines worked in it, from the modern-day Black Butte mine all the way to Quayle near Blairtown. About 9 of them produced the most coal, and 5 of them had the most significant surface impact. In all, between 1868 and 1940, 50 million tons were produced in the Rock Springs region. The mine workings roughly followed the surface landscape that can be seen in the surrounding bluffs and ridges. The back sections of the Rock Springs uplift that we live on in Rock Springs tilts at about a 9-degree angle, and the coal formations are all sandwiched in the sandstone and shale. The geologic breaks, uplifts, and faults complicate understanding of where the coal was located and mined, but the main effect was that wherever a good seam of Rock Springs Formation's coal was found, the miners went after it. And regarding subsidence, the further the coal was mined away from the surface outcrop, the less chance subsidence would occur, especially if the seam was beneath a sturdy shelf of Mesa Verde sandstone. About 100 feet or more of overburden between the roof of the old mine and the surface will qualify as moderate risk for subsidence. Most of Rock Springs is not in this category or at severe risk for subsidence. The number 1 mine was one of the biggest operations, starting in 1868. The mine entry went underground and directly under the Union Pacific main tracks, between the Bunning Freight Building and Bachetto's European Market on Broadway Street. Mines in those days used a big steel cable drawworks powered by steam that required a straight line to pull the loads of coal uphill to the tipple to unload. So they built 2 parallel main hallways that tunneled from there all the way beneath College Hill. On the surface seen here, they were aimed approximately at the blue water tower in the distance. The end of the main hallway was 1.5 miles from the entry near Buschetto's back door on South Front Street. The placement and direction of the mine hallways created mine arms that were roughly even on both sides. How Meller, Wardell, and Young located the site with little surveying and no test drilling was quite a feat in the middle of what was then a rocky desert. The western arms of this mine went past Blairtown, though deep underground, and the northeastern half went beneath what is called Number 4 Town, several blocks beyond the location of Grubb's restaurant. Another part of the Number 1 mine was the abandoned underground horse and mule barn that may have held several hundred horses at any given time. This huge corral was close to the surface and eventually resulted in the collapse of North Front Street in the 1980s. The original Number 2 mine was located near the intersection of Hickory Street and Blairtown Road. Digging here began not long after 1870, when Number 1 mine was hitting its stride. The Number 1 coal seam was more than 6 feet thick in that area and temptingly close to the surface, so they went after it despite having to make a cut through rock to get to it. The mine was short-lived, but ended up causing a lot of damage almost immediately. The 1908 map shows caves already causing problems near the mine entrance. These same workings caused a very large trough-type subsidence event at the front steps of the OLS Catholic Church, collapsing the entire street in January of 1949. Commissioner Fred Radosevich told the story of going downtown to find the entire street gone, from the base of the church steps to the other side of the street. The subsidence at the intersection of Broadway and B Street in front of the historic City Hall was also probably related to the Number 1 or the Number 2 mines. This event produced a slight settlement of the building and the clock tower, which enabled a $1 million grant to be used to restore the building and transform it into a museum. There was another, much larger, Union Pacific mine Number 2, the Central Coal and Coke Number 2. The tipple was located at the current intersection of the South Belt Route and Highway 430. This mine exploited the Number 7 seam and took coal from beneath the Palisades area and the cemetery all the way east through town to the Prairie Addition. The Number 3 UP mine went into the ground just north of Ridge Avenue. This mine tipple was adjacent to Chinatown and was a mainstay of production from 1873 to about 1895, when it was abandoned due to a fire. This mine had little surface damage associated with it because the workings went north under a solid sandstone ridge into areas that do not have a great deal of residential development. However, some of the air shafts were not effectively refilled, and there have been cases of homeowners in the Ridge Avenue area discovering deep caverns hidden beneath the walls and floors of their basements. The Rocket Miner contained this mention, quote, "Don Leitner didn't realize how deep his basement was until he unearthed an old mine shaft at his home on Ridge Avenue. He was just starting to remodel his basement when he discovered an abandoned mine shaft while knocking down a drywall." When dealing with subsidence, 99% of the time we are dealing with old horizontal workings that sometimes collapse towards the surface. When an event does reach the surface, it just looks like a few feet of the top layer has dropped somewhat. This is enough to damage utilities, concrete, and foundations sometimes, but is generally not a dangerous deep hole in most circumstances. Air shafts are the exception to the rule. The miners normally filled these shafts with rocks and dirt all the way to the top, but sometimes they left them or only partially filled them. Sometimes they were recorded on mine maps and sometimes they were not. The DEQ has worked hard to locate and complete the elimination of these hazards, as is required by the Abandoned Mine Land Act. The number 4 UP mine gave number 4 town its name, but it did not mine coal below that community. The tipples were located against the bluff south of Veterans Memorial Park. There were several stories and incidents of note related to this mine. A boiler house building burned without much damage to the equipment it contained. The photo shows burned timbers and a deployed fire hose. Other stories concern the horses and mules used in the mines. Although the miners worked the livestock in the mines extremely hard, they valued the animals that they worked with very much and were concerned for the welfare of the horses and mules as they shared in the many perils and labors of mining. Mine animals are frequently shown sporting leather caps meant to protect them from the ledges and falling rocks. However, it was often said by the miners that the UP cared more for the livestock than it did for the miners. In 1892, an event happened that could be called the Great Mule Rescue. A sudden fire threatened the lives of all the horses and mules and everyone else in the number 4 mine. The main haulage way was blocked and full of smoke. Somehow the miners hoisted all of them, which was more than 30 of the animals, out via a vertical air shaft, one at a time, using block and tackle equipment. The rescue was rightfully much celebrated. As usual, when the word got around town that there was an incident at a mine, miners would ask, "Did they lose any mules?" Sad to say, the only official place name that we have today that's left to remember the animals by is the name of Dead Horse Canyon, the final resting place of many of the overworked draft animals. Years later, on June 26, 1939, when the number 4 mine used a more modern hoist, there was another near disaster. The hoist normally would run all day, bringing loaded cars up the slope of the rail line and lowering the empty ones back down. Only twice each day would the cars have something in them besides coal or lumber, and that would be the miners. They called this hoist operation the man trip. The hoist operator, referred to as the engineer or hoistman, was a senior operator who took his job very seriously, especially when the miners were in the cars. He knew what was at stake. The procedure stated that 2 engineers were supposed to be attending the man trip, but on this occasion the engineer, working alone, suffered a heart attack and could not operate the powerful hoist. The miners quickly realized that there was a problem and jumped out of the moving cars. No fatalities are reported among the miners, but the cars continued up the mine entry and badly damaged the tipple. Hoist operator William Powell was found dead of a heart attack, his hand still on the controls. There were 2 versions of the number 5 UP mine, both located in the same area. The first was a slope mine located close to College Hill, across Bitter Creek from the Honda Toyota store parking lot. The second version of this mine was this 180-foot deep shaft that penetrated down to the number 3 seam. This photo of the number 5 mine shows the loading system for the early coal hauling boxcars. A chute would begin the filling out of the tipple, but then a crew would have to go into the boxcars and shovel the coal by hand as high as they could stack it. The cars were, of course, unloaded entirely by hand. Here is the loading crew from the UP number 1 mine. The number 6 UP mine, known as Pit 6, was located north of I-80 and on the west side of Kilpecker Creek, past the horse corrals. The ambush or fight that started the Rock Springs-Chinese Massacre took place in the number 5 entry of that mine on September 2nd of 1885. A dispute over a room full of blasted coal caused an argument that soon became a full-blown fight with as many as 10 white miners and 10 Chinese swinging at each other with picks, shovels, and other metal tools in near total darkness. The minimal flames of their lamps provided the only light during the deadly melee. These standing stones and a large piece of timber marked the area close to where the fateful drift mine entered the ground. More about this incident in the next section. Mines 7, 8, 9, and 10 All could be found in the Veterans Park Bluff area, including where I-80 goes through the hillside. Early in their tenure of use, they were joined for ventilation and haulage purposes and were operated as one big mine. They were so big that eventually miners could board the cars near Veterans Park, use them as an underground subway, and travel more than 4.5 miles to the area of the BLM horse corrals known as E-Plane. They would then emerge and go underground again to work at Reliance, UP number 11 mine, and several of the other pits. Entries for these mines are continuous all the way from Veterans Park to Reliance. The complex of bluffs east of Highway 191 are heavily undermined. Since these mines started at the bottom of the bluffs at Veterans Park, they took cover and went deep early, and little subsidence has been associated with them. However, in 2024, a drill and cement project was conducted by the DEQ to verify that the voids beneath I-80 caused by mining there were filled.